All right. Good morning, everybody. It is 9:30, so we're going to get our meeting started. Welcome. Looks like we got about 21 people on the meeting right now, and I'm sure more people would be joining us. My name is Jim Ostrowski. I work in EGLE's Environmental Support Division. I'm just going to help kind of in the background today, help James and Kimber out with some of the moderation and kind of background stuff. So just going to run through a few things as we get started. A lot of you, I think, were on for the first meeting we had last week, but I will go through these guidelines again for the meeting just to let you know. You all came in muted, and if you would, please keep your lines muted throughout the meeting unless you're called upon to speak. So please do that. I'll keep an eye on it. If somebody accidentally mutes themselves, I might remute you, but just make sure you do that. Cameras are optional, so we have our cameras on. If you want to turn your camera on, go right ahead and turn it on. That's fine, especially during the Q&A portion. If you have a question that you want to ask, you are welcome to do that. You have the chat function enabled, and so if you want to add a question or a comment in the chat, you can go ahead and do so. Just let you know everybody can see it, and it's an open chat. We would like you to keep it related to official comments and questions. We don't really want a whole lot of background chatter going on during the meeting. So if you would keep it to those official types of things. When we get to the Q&A part and the commenting part, if you want to make a comment or a question, just to keep things running smooth and easy. If you want to make a comment, you can click the raise hand icon in your toolbar, and either James or Kimber or I will call on you, and you can unmute yourself to make your comment. You can also put your question and comment, like I said, in the chat. That's a good way to do it as well, because we'll be keeping an eye on that. And please keep your comments and questions concise, because a lot of times we'll get a lot of them and want to make sure we get through as many of them we can. And if you haven't noticed already, this meeting is being recorded. And if you were on the last meeting, that meeting was also recorded and it was posted on our YouTube channel. And I'll put a link to that in the chat in case if any of you want to go back and find that and look at it, because maybe you didn't attend last week's meeting. And I think, oh yeah, so comments and questions, again, use chat box, raise your hand. I don't see anybody that's just calling in on the phone only, but if anybody does call in on the phone, I'll remind them that you just hit #2, and that'll raise your hand and let us make sure you get unmuted. With that, I'm going to turn it over to James. James, you can take it away. I think, Kimber, you're running the slides for him, right? All right.
Thank you very much, Jim. Appreciate it. Just a couple of more kind of introductory comments here and kind of how we're going to run the show. It is basically going to be the same material we covered last week. A tweak here and there. We kind of gave you a few insights on things we still had under consideration, and we'll fill you in on those. But how we plan to do it is we plan to spend we plan to do it in 3 sections. First, we're going to talk about the definition of overburdened community and significantly overburdened. We're going to then break and take questions or comments on that part up to about a half hour. We're going to kind of try to keep it at 30 minutes for each section just to make sure we get it through everything. And then we'll do the scoring for the clean water and the scoring for the drinking water. Each of those kind of broken into 15-minute presentation, about 15 minutes for questions and comments. At the end, hopefully we'll have some time to just take questions or comments on anything, but that's kind of how we plan to work through the material. Worked pretty well last week. I thought we had a good conversation. So Kimber, you want to go ahead and bring the presentation up? All right, next slide. Next slide. Again, introduction. My name is James Clift. I'm the one of the deputy directors at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, and been helping kind of coordinate some of the work as it revolves around kind of the definition of overburdened community. And this slide just kind of points out, you know, some of the important aspects of that designation that pursuant to the statute that passed earlier this year, projects within overburdened communities will be awarded at least 20 points, and you'll see in the scoring later that 20 points is awarded, and 25 points if for a significantly overburdened community out of 100. So significant priority there, making sure those projects kind of rise up in our priority list, and hopefully we're able to fund them. Projects will also be eligible for loan forgiveness for some of the borrowed funds if those designations apply, and it might be different percentages for overburden versus significantly overburdened. And lastly, we have the ability to apply different interest rates for those communities, again, trying to reduce that overall cost of them borrowing money through the SRF process. Next slide. This kind of just shows you a little busy, but I'll walk you through it here on how that loan forgiveness has worked over the last couple of years. You see on the left-hand side, kind of the value of the loans. You see that kind of exponentially growing from in 2018, we were around 60, 70 million up to over 250 million in 2021. That number, of course, is going to exponentially increase again this week, not quite exponentially, but a significant increase again this year. But we've also been able to increase that principal forgiveness, ramping up from, that's where you have to look on the right side to see the right kind of metric, from $5 million a year in 2018 to over $20 million a year, almost $25 million a year in 2021. That number we also expect to see increase, and this is both on the clean water side. And then the next slide shows you kind of the same information on the drinking water history. Loans that we were kind of down around $50 million a year, up over 200 million last year. We again expect that one to increase significantly this year. And you see that loan forgiveness going from a little under $4 million to over $10 million. Again, we expect to see that increase. So that loan forgiveness becoming a bigger and bigger part of our program as we move forward. Next slide. Our goals, as we were kind of looking at this definition of overburden and significantly overburdened, is the language that had been in the statute had grown very there was some very obsolete language in there, references to terms that the US Census Bureau has not used in a long time. So we're going to eliminate that language. We want to the extent possible, make it clear to a community whether or not they're going to qualify in advance. So them or their consultants could go through our spreadsheet and do the calculation and have a pretty good idea that whether or not they were going to basically qualify under one of these definitions prior to the application going in. Again, when the intents to apply go in, it's just a simple 2-page form. Our staff then starts to work with those communities and walk you through kind of that calculation we do. We're going to expand beyond income as the primary criteria. We've got an affordability metric that looks at rate in relationship to kind of the median annual household income for a community. And we are going to add kind of a new measure there that looks at the taxable value of the property within the community as one of the metrics. We think this will better capture kind of the universe of communities that have seen underinvestment over time. And lastly, we're trying to be sensitive to minimizing the burden we placed on communities to gather all the necessary information. We unfortunately can't eliminate all of that, but we have tried to reduce that burden going forward. Next slide. A couple of important considerations is, when you look at a community, and we're talking about an overburdened community in relationships to the state revolving fund programs, they're usually what we're looking at as the service territory of the service provider. So if this is a water utility, the community is basically all that entire area they serve. A lot of times we'll get multiple communities inside of one service area. So for purposes of kind of the calculations that go into whether or not someone qualifies as overburdened or significantly overburdened, we do kind of a blended calculation based on the percentage of kind of people served in each of those communities and looking at the various metrics and doing that kind of blended calculation. What we realize, and we'll see as we go through this program, is we kind of had to draw the line somewhere. And the idea was, trying to push as much resources we could to those communities that truly kind of deserved it. Not that there's, many communities that kind of deserve support and more support, but, EGLE get a certain amount of money in the bucket to provide additional resources to these communities. If we make the definition really broad, that money will be spread thinner over more communities versus kind of focusing it on fewer communities. One of the concepts that's been talked about a lot recently is the Justice 40 program, where the federal government, the White House, looking at federal programs, a number of the buckets of federal money, with the idea that 40% of the money in those buckets should be spent to benefit kind of overburdened communities. Well, if 40% of your population lives in those communities, then they're really just getting their fair share. So we're looking at a definition that makes sure that they're kind of getting more support than average kind of going forward. And really, last one is really important, is that not all EGLE or federal programs use the same definition. We have started to engage other state agencies across the state to see if we can come up with a common definition that would be used with multiple grant programs across agencies. And the other agencies have been very receptive to that discussion, and we're going to continue that discussion going forward after we kind of finalize our decision here. Department of Treasury has had at least one program that had communities, I think the term they used was communities in need, where they use the taxable value database. We'll talk about that a little later. But of course, then the HHS and other agencies also have similar programs. Next slide. The statute that passed required the EGLE kind of evaluate and address the following list of criteria. And we're going to go through each of these one at a time and talk about kind of the evaluation we did and talk about why we included it or didn't include it within our definition. Next slide. On income and unemployment, we currently use income, median annual household income, and kind of its relationship to rates, or in the case of significantly overburdened, just looking at income. We explored really carefully looking at using the cutoff for the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of the population in the community. But working with the state demographer, we've realized that this data set is in a way a little bit of biased in and of itself. And it comes from the fact that when communities start to get really small, there's not enough data to calculate the lowest quintile. So of the 1,500 communities plus in Michigan, for the smallest 100, they don't even do the calculation. And for a good portion of the ones over that, the margin of error, it's really just a rough guess of what that cutoff is. So we decided we're going to wait. We're going to continue to explore this kind of moving forward. And again, we were hoping to, there has been some criticism of the use of median annual household income across the country. We're not sure if it was a big issue in Michigan. We're going to keep looking at this number over time to see if we could use it in the future. But at this point, we're worried about a definite bias against small communities, and therefore don't believe that we're going to include this in the definition that we're going to propose. The second part of this is unemployment data. We've talked to the people over at LEO, the state agency that tracks unemployment data for the state. And what we find is that we have very detailed information, but it's only at the county level and large city level. For purposes of this program, we need data sets that get finer than that. We need to have them down to the community level in order to make our determinations. Data sets that only operate well at the county level don't tend to give us good enough information to make decisions. So we don't plan to use unemployment within our definition. We do realize that it indirectly reflects on income within a community, so it is partially reflected. But there won't be any direct reference to unemployment in the proposed definition. Next slide. It asks us to look at population trends, and we know kind of from anecdotal evidence that this was going to be an issue, that we realized that many communities have seen significant population declines over time, leaving kind of less citizens there trying to fund programs to to fund infrastructure for an entire community that was built. The city of Detroit, classic example, 2 million people once lived in the city. Now something over 650, kind of supporting that significant infrastructure. So we knew the burden was there. And what we did is we started looking at last year's numbers. And what we found was that all the communities with at least a 5% decline over the last 10 years had already been designated. That if we looked over a 20-year period, that all of the communities but one had already been designated. And over a 30-year period, if we looked at a decline of 20%, again, every community but one had already been designated. So we decided that we thought we were already kind of capturing this within our current definitions. So to reduce kind of, again, the burden and paperwork aspect of it, since we didn't see it adding a lot of value in kind of capturing communities that weren't otherwise captured, we're not going to propose using population trend in the definition itself. Next slide. Housing costs and value. Obviously an important part of kind of the disposable income for a community. Again, the data set looks a lot like the unemployment data set. Most of the data from this area comes from something called the American Housing Survey. They survey mainly on the county basis, is the way it ends up happening. It's pretty accurate at the county level, maybe select major cities, but not any finer grade than that. And what they do by alternating surveys, what they do is they survey one set of communities 1 year, another set of communities the following year, then they go back, they go back, they go back. Saw a significant makeover in 2015, kind of disrupts a little bit of the trend data that you see in this area. We realize that organizations like Alice Project and things like that have looked at this data. We think it's relevant to looking at kind of overall burden on folks, but again, data set not fine enough grade to use within this program. Next slide. The legislation has us to look at annual user cost and cost allocation among classes. So annual user cost, we are going to continue to use that. We're not going to propose changing this year kind of how that works, which is to the extent that rates exceed 1% of the median annual household income, we will see that as an overburdened community. That is, again, more and more communities will end up qualifying under that 1% number. I could see us kind of moving that number up over time, but we're not going to propose raising this number this year within our proposed definition. When we look at kind of, that user cost, we really are looking at, the revenue necessary to operate the system along with kind of the new debt is kind of how that calculation gets made. Next slide. When we looked at the cost allocation, we decided that this would not provide EGLE basically any kind of actionable information. And that's because we have never collected this in the past. So we would really kind of have no idea what to do once we got it. Allocation among user class can be influenced by a number of factors, including the size, number, location of non-residential users within the community and what that mix looks like. How close are they located to a treatment plant? Is there an elevation change? A lot of things go into kind of calculating water rates. And we didn't think that basically we had any guidance on how we could use cost allocation in making a decision, and that it would be kind of cost prohibitive, both for the locals to kind of gather this information for what we would see as kind of limited ability by us to use it. Next slide. Asked us to look at existing public health and environmental impacts. And what we think in this area is that we use a number of public health and environmental impacts within the scoring criteria themselves that help kind of move a project up the project list. We think kind of that's a good place to kind of include it in this case, and we can kind of give them more emphasis in that way, making sure that we're funding those projects that will have the greatest potential impact on public health and protecting the environment. And we'll talk about that a little Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about significantly overburdened community and our proposed definition there. Basically, we're just going to have two qualifying criteria, and it does not look at affordability of rates at all. It just looks at income and taxable value. And for income, we're going to propose using 125% of the poverty level for a family of 4. That language is currently kind of in the statute itself as a disadvantaged community. We're going to include it as a significantly overburdened community. I believe, and again, we're just finishing cleaning up our data set that we hope to share here very shortly with you. About, I think, 80, 90 communities in the state would qualify under kind of this income metric. The second one is looking at taxable value per capita. And we think this can be a really good one that captures kind of long-term disinvestment in a community. And what we've set it at for significantly overburdened is looking at the kind of the lowest 10% of the state's population, kind of by community. And for this data set, it works out to those communities that have a per capita taxable base of 15,200 or less. And again, we'll be able, once we release the spreadsheet, you'll see kind of what communities kind of fall into that category. Next slide. For overburdened, we're going to, keep using that taxable value. We're going to take it up to the lowest 20% of the state. And those will be communities that have taxable values at less than 22,550. We realize that in most cases, water rates aren't raised through the property tax system, so they're not, directly related to this. But again, we think this is a pretty good measure of kind of disinvestment over time in a community. And as I mentioned before, we'll still have the overburdened community of those that have rates over 1% of their median annual household income. Next slide. And that's it. So take any kind of questions or comments on the definition.
Thanks, James. Sure, I want to remind people that if you do have a question, you can click the raise hand button. And looks like we got a couple of hands raised there, James. So you can call on them.
Yeah.
Good morning. Hi, James. Thank you for that. It's very helpful. Looking forward to seeing some of the details, trying to take it all in at once, and we'll watch the recording. But I had a question. I had a question at the time that the statute was being drafted, and I have it now, and that has to do with the last slide that had to do with the area served by the proposed project. Could you just talk a little bit more about that as it relates to a specific application to do work in an area? And yeah, I just had some context I wanted to gain there.
I'm not an expert in this area, so we may end up phoning a friend, but the bottom line is I believe these are federal requirements on how we define the community. And basically the community is who is going to basically pay for the project. So to the extent that a project is paid by all of the people served by a utility, then the project area is that entire area, even though a pocket within the system might be disadvantaged, and that might be where this particular project is. If the cost of the project is spread among all ratepayers, you look at the entire service territory of the utility when making this designation. I don't know if there's anybody else that wanted to further clarify. That's my understanding of how that works. And that's pursuant to the federal guidelines.
Okay, that's helpful. There was a little confusion as I was reviewing some of these documents. So, in particular around lead service line replacement and how that plays into what you just described. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that point, we realize that is one of the places that this doesn't work as well as you might want it to provide support to those you want. So that's the reason that you'll see a number of pots of money the legislature set up that operate kind of outside the SRF, where we might be able to go down the list of like lead service line replacement, and we might run out of our regular SRF funds, but we might still have some money left in that lead service line pot, and we might be able to use that for other communities that are doing that work in particular. So and then some grants may operate totally outside of the SRF process. I think of things like our technical assistance grants that the legislature gave us $48 million in that area, and will be focused directly on those communities and helping those communities. So basically the SRF can't meet all needs, but we're trying to figure out kind of how it overlaps. Some of these different pots of monies might overlap to try to focus some money into those areas that need it the most. Jill.
Good morning, James. Thanks for this presentation. I have a basic question about the using the criteria of median household income. I mean, as you mentioned, we know how bad that can be when communities get really stratified between high income and low income. It just really doesn't help. So I'm just wondering why there isn't one more push to look at maybe percentage of poverty or something like that, so that we're not further burdening the bottom end of those communities that may have that problem.
Yeah, so this is where, again, I mentioned that we want to continue to look at this. One of the questions is how many communities in Michigan have the big stratification issue, especially when you think of it not only on a community basis, but on a water utility basis. Do we see the same problem we're seeing around the country? And I'm not quite sure yet. But we are trying to look at that issue to see whether or not we're glossing over. We got a couple of grants we put out for kind of work in the water affordability space. We expect those reports back a little later this year. We're hoping that that might shed a little bit of light on this question. But really, the only thing that got us to back off, because we really did want to try to use that lowest quintile as a second measure, it was just the fact that we didn't know how messy that data set got when you looked at the bottom of it. And really for small communities, virtually a non-existent data set. And you can imagine if a community only has a few hundred people, of trying to figure out what that lowest 20% make, you almost have to call everybody to get the data. So we're trying to figure out ways to address it. It's a good point. And the income level and the significant overburden really is designed to make sure we pick up those communities that are seeing kind of that have the most number of people within that poverty range and that low taxable value, to make sure we're not missing those. So really you'd have to stratify the ones that maybe don't make that cutoff and are just above that. Do they have significant pockets that we're somehow missing with our current definition? But again, so we capture some of it with the significant overburden, not all of it. And we're going to keep looking at that other question. The legislature, of course, is letting us revise this every 3 years. So we're
going to live with this for 3 years. Wow.
Yeah, that's the legislation requires that we revisit it not less than every 3 years, unless they give us authorization to do so.
But you can revisit more often.
No, we can't. I'm sorry, did I misspeak? Yeah, we can only, at most, we can do it every 3 years.
Okay. Well,
So,
I just want to strongly say, I think not taking more time to look at if there's a way to parse out those really small communities or something like that is, I'm very concerns about that.
If you got folks that want to propose language, we're willing to look at it. We tried, we struggled, and again, we're finding it very helpful to kind of apply our new standard and try to look backwards to see how it would actually change things. And this is an area that we plan to do that in too, just so we can continue to learn as we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Nahara?
It's Nair. Thank you. I wanted to ask you to go into a little bit more detail around the pre-qualification, or like you're qualified, like that 2-page document that you mentioned, because like we do all know that like the Shared Credit Rating Act can be an impediment for communities that would be eligible for principal forgiveness, because they would be required to be bonded for the full amount. So I wanted to know, like, how are you designing that document to reflect, the current constraints of that law?
This is definitely an area that I'm not an expert in, but it has been raised, and I have kind of sat in on at least a couple of conversations that kind of get into this issue. My understanding is Michigan is a little different than some of our neighboring states. I'm not sure if kind of getting away from this issue will require a legislative change. I'm not sure we can do it internally. I don't know if anybody else on the line wants to add. Any of my phone of friends from the department want to get into this anymore, but Paul looks like he'd like to.
Yeah. So no, this is a great question. And now that the legislation that guides the SRF process has been signed, this is the next phase in evolution and taking a look at and determining if legislative changes are proposed, the impact to the SRF process and the loaning processes there. It's definitely something on EGLE's radar. We'll have to partner with our friends at the Michigan Finance Authority and Treasury in reviewing that legislation and the impact. But it is definitely on the agenda and something I have interest in taking a deeper dive into.
Cindy, you follow up there?
Yes, and thank you for raising that, Naira, and also Paul for, we've talked about this before, but I'm also curious about at the federal level, the way this money was made available in terms of the intent of the federal dollars. If there's something about Michigan's law that is an impediment to the federal intent around the principal forgiveness funds. We're not going to answer that here and now, but it is relevant to this conversation in the ways that Naira described. And I'm just really curious in those conversations with Treasury and others, if that is something that could be explored.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, definitely part of the conversation, Cindy. Have had preliminary conversations both with the Michigan Finance Authority and obviously our EPA contacts and Region 5 administrator is fully aware of Michigan's uniqueness on the bonding requirement, and we've had several conversations there. We're reviewed every year by EPA in compliance with the SRF and how we administer. Nothing has been brought up yet to date, but obviously I would agree with you philosophically. It creates an obstacle that is more challenging than what's present in other states.
Kelly.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for a presentation. I'm going to preface this like you, James. I'm not the expert on the financial side of that, certainly, but just a general question. When some of the verbiage you say kind of piqued an interest here, when you say, spreading the cost across all ratepayers for a project, I kind of wonder, how does this whole program fit into the context of BOLT and cost for service? And I think, like, was it related to lead service lines or any of particular projects? I mean, do you see this, when we start, I understand the context of the overburden and significant overburden. But when you say things like spreading all the costs around all the ratepayers, is that consistent with BOLT when we talk about it in that way? Or have you ever thought about this program in that context? Just kind of an overarching question.
Yeah, well, all rates are spread across all of the ratepayers within a particular water utility. So they use some formula to determine how those costs get spread across. And again, and my understanding is that's how the federal guidelines work, is if something basically gets wrapped into water rates, then you look at that entire universe of people paying the water rates. I think the good analogy, if you think about it, if some sort of special assessment district was set up for a project, that would then be the community that would define that project if it was being paid for through a special assessment versus through the regular water rates.
Right. Okay.
Hey, James, just want to let you know you got a couple questions too in the chat from Sarah and Danielle.
Let's see. Where'd my chat go? There we go. I know there was some request for us to kind of cite some of our regulations, and we can do that. I think we're in the process. We're going to set up a web page on this question, and we'll cite kind of the various regs on the website. We're hoping to include the proposed language and the spreadsheet that shows kind of how these dollar cutoffs, the work we got from the state demographer. We're hoping to have a spreadsheet that the communities are going to be able to kind of directly access. Sarah, you want to supplement your request there?
Yeah, I just had a question because I'm looking at an EPA memo from June 2022, and it talks about the challenges of defining a community and basically recognizes, that it can be problematic for pockets of populations. And in this memo, it talks about using an EJ screening tool to identify those communities that might be caught in that pocket. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you've considered. I mean, I know that you're relying on the federal, regulations and their definitions, but then the federal government is saying those are problematic. So I'm just wondering, how that is being addressed here, and if using some type of EJ screening tool is being considered as well.
In this case, we decided not to, and we'll get to the scoring criteria in a minute, just because a lot of those environmental impacts we kind of include within the scoring for projects themselves. Again, we get into this program because you kind of start to get into let's say a water utility that has a blended rate. I'm not quite sure how I would use the EJ screening tool to kind of be an input into a blended rate, because then you'd be kind of applying it to everybody. Again, not to say that the EGLE is definitely looking at programs. We think the screening tool is going to have great value for us. We think it's going to have great value for us, especially in kind of in many of our grant programs and targeting money exactly kind of where we'd like to see support occur. We're just seeing some challenges of trying to fit it in within the SRF model, and not sure that it adds enough value to try to shoehorn it in to the model itself at this time. But I mean, that's kind of our review to this point. I see someone else from Freshwater Future has her hand up. I can't tell who it is. I don't know if it's Jillian or, there you go.
It is me. Yeah, I just want to follow up on that a little bit, because the whole overburdened certainly makes it sound like we're talking about communities that would have some other environmental justice issues. Particularly, I would say, environmental issues. And so I guess I'm extremely concerned that we're looking at excluding all of that in this criteria that has to be there for at least 3 years, while we think this funding will last for 5. I mean, excluding those communities for 3/5 of the time just seems not a good idea. So I just want to understand what are the opportunities to think about those things. I know you guys have worked on a good EJ screening tool. I know there are other ones out there. Seems like we shouldn't be dismissing that for the first 3 years of the program.
Yeah, again, and what we plan to do is, once we've got these various definitions set, we'll GIS map it. We'll see how it kind of overlays with our EJ screening tool maps. We'll see if, to the extent that, are we missing communities, significant, communities in there, and try to figure out kind of A, how can it be supplemented with other grant programs, or B, how could it be refined? Again, at this point, the question is will the screening tool work for all programs? And we're struggling in the context of just this initial definition of who's an overburdened community within SRF. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, lots of definitions used across different programs, different tools used, the climate and economic justice screening tool at the federal level, used for some of our programs. Unfortunately, this is going to be a little confusing for communities, I think. So we're trying to figure out how we can build more consistency in this area. But again, at this point, we're not seeing how we can, easily blend it into this program and add the value we're hoping to add. But
will there be, once you do all that mapping and review, will there be more opportunities for public comment and review?
Well, here's what we have. Unfortunately, we're under a tight timeline given when the statute passed, in that we've got intents to apply for SRF next year due November 1 of this year. So we're trying to kind of get these definitions set so that communities can use them to apply for next year's money. So we really do need them set by, really October 1 at the latest or something like that. We're going to have a public hearing in September. Again, we're willing to take further comment on this point. And again, it's one that we looked at, pretty significantly, and only because we looked at, again, the scoring criteria, that we're going to cut this off and go into scoring, and we'll have some time for questions at the end, but only because we had some of the public health and environmental impacts within our other scoring criteria that we thought we were, again, trying to capture those projects that would best address some of those burdens we're seeing. Kelly, we're going to take your question, and then we're going to kind of move into the next section. But again, at the end, we will have time for just general questions on any topic.
Just quick mention, our GIS team has put together a pretty extensive equity emphasis and analysis tool online. Maybe you've seen it. We've also incorporated a lot of the environmental justice and Justice 40 data. So, I mean, I know it's just Southeast Michigan, but it might give an indicator of some of the considerations you're looking at if you wanted to use a tool like that to see what the results might be.
Yeah, again, the challenges we get, of course, we got to use statewide data sets and metrics. So it's, but again, I think the work on the tool has been great. We're hoping to incorporate it in more places. So at this point, let's jump to talking a little bit about our scoring, and then we can return to some of these other questions later.
Thanks, James. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dan Beauchamp. I'm the supervisor of our municipal permits unit. Joined with me today from Water Resource Division is Christy Alwyn, who is our manager of our stormwater permits unit within Water Resource Division. She's going to be available to answer any specific questions as it relates to the stormwater scoring criteria. Next slide, please. So just a few questions here. So, why do we need criteria? And it's really to prioritize projects for CW SRF funding. So for example, for years such as fiscal year 23 or most likely fiscal year 24, the number of projects that are attempting to get funding out of the CW SRF projects really going to exceed our fundable range. So the scoring criteria really prioritize which projects kind of move to the top of the list and get funded, and then unfortunately which projects will not get funded that year unless projects drop out or will get moved to another fiscal year. Historically, our scoring criteria has been contained in rules since the inception of the SRF program. And that really did not allow us to make any changes to our scoring criteria. And that scoring criteria was specified, like I said, in rule. So we were unable to, change the criteria to reflect, like current EGLE priorities or priorities of, permittees or municipalities. So for example, like PFAS is a good example. The existing scoring criteria, didn't necessarily award those projects as high as priority points as we would probably like to see. So basically the new legislation, allows us a lot of flexibility in developing scoring criteria. Another thing that the legislation does is it allows us to fund stormwater conveyance projects. So we'll get into this, when we talk about scoring, but what we're proposing is to have two different scoring criteria, one for wastewater projects, so clean water projects, and then another for stormwater projects. So these stormwater projects, again, we are allowed to periodically, like James said, not more than 3 years, update our priorities based on what we're hearing from permittees and regulated communities. Next slide, please. So for our proposed scoring criteria, we're planning on awarding points based on 5 kind of broad categories. And the future slides will get into specifics on how we're planning on awarding points for these categories. But there's five broad categories that we kind of are proposing to include. The first is compliance. So those communities that have some kind of are under some kind of compliance program. We are proposing to give priority points for those so they can get corrected. Generally they're under a compliance program because they're having exceedances of water quality standards or violations of state or federal law. So we think it's important to prioritize those projects so they can get fixed. The second one is public health. We've been seeing some, very high intensity storm events throughout the state. And as a result of these high intensity events and, there's been, a fair amount or quite a bit of raw sewage being discharged from, separate sanitary sewer systems, combined sewer systems. So we want to prioritize those projects that are being done to protect public health. The next one is water quality. Again, that's part of EGLE's mission is protecting public health and the environment. So prioritizing projects aimed at improving water quality so that the receiving water is protected for its designated uses. The fourth broad category is improving infrastructure. I know this isn't a surprise to anyone on the call, but from the 21st Century Infrastructure Report to the grades that the American Society of Civil Engineers gives us, our infrastructure for wastewater and stormwater, is failing. So we want to prioritize projects aimed at improving that infrastructure and increasing its reliability and ability to serve the communities. And the fourth one is affordability. I think James talked about affordability in depth, so we want to prioritize projects that are really for communities that are having affordability issues. So finally, I kind of talked about this earlier, but we're proposing 2 separate different scoring criterias for wastewater, clean water projects and stormwater projects. These projects will use similar categories, but the very specifics of how we're set up priority points will be different. We'll get into that in the next slides. So for the first main category, compliance. So if a project is required based on an enforceable schedule. So for the first one we'll talk about is clean water. Enforceable schedule contained in an NPDES permit, administrative consent order, or a consent judgment, that will be 15 points. One thing important to note here is the total points possible is 100. So you can kind of think of it as the percentage of the total allocation of points. So for clean water compliance, 15 points. Next one, stormwater projects. If that project is a result of a violation notice for an MS4 permit, we're proposing 5 priority points for that. The next one is improving infrastructure. So if the project comes from, an asset management program, as a result of an asset management program, we're proposing to give that 20 points for clean water. Next one, if it's a regionalization project, then we're proposing 20 points. And then finally, if it's resiliency, so such as, increasing the reliability of sanitary pump stations, doing work to increase the electrical reliability of the system, or basement backup protection, we're proposing 20 points for that. One thing to note here is that for this category, there's a maximum point allowable of 20 points. So say, for example, there's a project and it's from your asset management program, it deals with resiliency and also has regionalization. Each of those sub scoring would be 20 points, but really the total points that would be awarded in this is 20 points. Now I'll move on to stormwater projects. If the project comes out of an asset management program, we're proposing 20 points. And then if it's a regionalization project, we're proposing 20 points. So same thing with clean water, the total maximum awarded for this category is 20 points. Now we'll get into the category of affordability. So this is the category that we have the least ability to change, because the legislation required us to give at least 20% of the total points awarded to overburdened communities. So for both clean water and stormwater, we're proposing 20 points for overburdened, and then an additional 5 points, so 25 points for significantly overburdened communities. Next slide, please. Next, we'll talk about public health. So for clean water, again, a lot of this is geared at reducing raw sewage discharges. So the first one is sanitary sewer overflow, or like wastewater treatment plant bypass scoring. So for wet weather related SSOs or treatment plant bypasses, we're proposing to give 20 points for those communities that are not meeting, Michigan's SSO policy. So our Michigan's SSO policy, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is being able to transport and treat all flows up to our remedial design standard, which is the 25-year, 24-hour storm event. Next, under the SSO or bypass scoring kind of criteria is operational related SSOs. So we're proposing 20 points for documented dry weather SSOs due to structural concerns that cause like chronic operational issues. Next, under the public health category, we'll talk about combined sewer overflow scoring. So we're planning kind of a tiered point total here, depending on the reduction of annual untreated CSO volume. So if the project is, say it's a sewer separation project, or it's a project aimed at adequately treating the untreated CSO volume, we'll look at an annual CSO volume. So if that annual CSO volume reduction is greater than 10 million gallons, then it'll be 20 points. If it's between 5 and 10, we're proposing 15 points. And then if it's less than 5 million gallons on an annual basis, then we're proposing 10 points. Then finally, for the public health category, the biosolids scoring for PFOS. So we're proposing 20 points here if the project is aimed at meeting the 20 parts per billion PFOS that's kind of expressed in our interim biosolid strategy. So you see here in this category, it's a maximum of 20 points. We're not proposing anything for the stormwater. Those are added into the water quality points. I think, we probably really could have moved some of those water quality, stormwater to this, to public health. I just don't want anyone to think that we think that stormwater doesn't have any impact on public health, because it obviously does. So next slide, please. So for our water quality scoring criteria, so for clean water, we're proposing to use water quality severity points. So what that means is if the project is going to have an improvement to water quality for, say, for example, dissolved oxygen, nutrients, toxics, or microorganisms, we're going to have a scoring criteria that will give points based on, improvements to those kind of parameters. We're proposing 20 points maximum awarded for this category. So for example, for PFAS or PFAS projects, this is where additional priority points will be awarded specifically under the toxics category here. Next, we'll move over to stormwater. This is the largest kind of group for stormwater. So maximum of 50 points total here for this category. So if the project makes progress towards achieving a TIMDL pollutant load reduction in the MS4 permit, we're proposing 10 points. Next one, if the project results in reduced stormwater runoff from qualifying BMPs, and those qualifying BMPs, the list of that was taken from the Oakland County standard. One thing to note here is really the primary focus of the project really has to be stormwater runoff reduction, or reduction of volume from stormwater runoff. We're proposing up to 20 points for this. Next, if the results in water quality treatment of an existing discharge, we're proposing 10 points. Next is results in disconnection of existing impervious surfaces. If the project results in, disconnection of existing impervious surfaces, we're proposing 10 points for that. And then finally, if it results in a regional BMPs to address known local site issues. So say, for example, under the MS4 post-construction requirement, the site could not implement the total requirements under the post-construction, then because of clay soils or contamination, if the project is a regional BMP, then we're proposing 10 points for that. So again, 50 points maximum for this category. Next slide, please. So here's kind of just a table that shows kind of where each of the points based on the category kind of lie. So for the clean water, we're proposing 15% or 15 points for compliance, 20 for public health, 20 for water quality, 20 for improving infrastructure, and then 25 for affordability. On the stormwater side, 5 for compliance, and then 50 points or 50% of the total amount would be water quality, 20% for improving infrastructure, and then 25 for affordability. So next slide. So I think that's it for the clean water program. So I think we'll open it up for questions.
Kelly, go ahead.
You're muted, Kelly.
My apologies. Sorry, I can't resist talking about stormwater. I have a number of questions, but I'm just going to start with just a quick couple. Do you have a direct set aside for stormwater projects as part of this, new approach with the funding?
Yeah, I think that's the plan. Yeah, there's going to be flexibility built in depending on the number of projects is how we plan to fund stormwater. And one other thing I forgot to mention is in addition to stormwater, we have non-point source projects too. That isn't kind of a focus of today's meeting because we're not proposing to change the scoring criteria for non-point source project. So there'll be kind of 3 buckets of different projects or types of projects that will be getting funded.
Well, because we all know historically stormwater, there are a lot of challenges with it, but historically stormwater projects other than water quality haven't been typically that eligible. Like less than 1% of the funding goes to stormwater. We know there are a lot of, stormwater utility, there's no rate base. We know those are issues, but I have to say, on the flooding side of things. Now, Dan, you said conveyance projects are eligible. When we talk about flooding, I would almost make that analogous to PFAS and lead service lines. And because it doesn't happen everywhere, it's not a problem with every single community, but when it happens, it's detrimental. And over the last decade, we've had these significant flooding issues that have happened and have caused millions and billions in damage. And I say that because what's happening is the transition on who's saying that the priorities are. We have an 80-person task force for water infrastructure, and we do a survey. What's your number one priority? Stormwater and flooding. And it's not just the combined sewer areas, it's across our whole region. And the feds are prioritizing it: flooding and resiliency, future rain events, climate resiliency. And I really don't see this in this program. And I think that as we are all being looked at to help solve these problems, federal highways pushing all these new requirements that are coming down to the state DOTs and the MPOs, EGLE needs to be part of that solution with your ability in these programs. And I say that with, we did an investment needs analysis for our infrastructure in our region. Our stormwater investment needs are more than $1 billion a year, $1 billion. And a lot of that relates both to water quality and flooding. And I would say flooding is a public health one. You need to have flooding in the public health category. And, with that, I guess my comment is it really needs to be emphasized through this program in a way, and it doesn't solve the issue with the whole utility and the rate base and all of that. And that's why I said, can you set aside and do more principal forgiveness? How do we grow these programs? How does EGLE become part of the solution to support stormwater projects that address both water quality and flooding? Because even Christy, the criteria for water quality, green infrastructure is great, but when we're talking about flooding, it's not going to be the be it all end all solution to address these challenges. And communities are really struggling on that issue.
Thanks.
Well, and maybe just to respond briefly to that, just wanted to say, our starting point was really to think about water quality just broadly as the beginning, and also to sort of incorporate the range of projects. So the focus here was really just as a starting point to put everything in water quality, not to say it doesn't have a public health benefit too. And we can make that adjustment. This was really just our beginning point, but we thought, initially, if we focus on water quality, we can capture from a small green infrastructure project all the way up to flooding. Maybe we need to make some adjustments or clarification there. But that is still our idea. But as a first approach, we thought we would just put it all within the water quality category.
All right, thanks. A question for us, Harry? Get your hand up.
Yeah, I did hear you. Sorry. I guess I'll repeat what I said in the first meeting, that I think it'd be hard to see how stormwater projects, first of all, they're all clean water projects. You have two categories, and you're calling one of them clean water and one of them stormwater, which seems to indicate that one of them is what the program was intended for, and the other is something else, which I think they're all, just going back to Christy's comments, if you start with clean water being the objective, then I think the scoring criteria should have a larger component of a clean water measurement or analytical component to it. And I think, going back to my previous comment, it would be good to run some projects that were in last year, 4 or 5 years ago, because there are non-point source projects in those project priority lists. And there are stormwater projects in that list, and we can provide others to see how they would score and how they would fare. It would also be instructive to go back and look at the dollars spent per water quality parameter control, per component of water pollution control, because without that, I think the scoring going forward would be somewhat subjective.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions or comments at this point? All right, let's run through drinking water. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Just a question, what, if there's any discussion kind of internally there on the compliance metric as possibly a economic moral hazard or disincentive to kind of longer term proactive investment, and just what the thoughts are on that.
I guess that, that's a good question. I think, from an EGLE standpoint, if they're under an administrative consent order or consent judgment or one of those things, those are usually you get there, those are large issues, right? So those are ones that we want to see, not to say that we don't want to see other projects funded or anything like that, but those are ones that have a direct tie to significant, state or federal, violations of, the Clean Water Act that we want to see, get fixed as soon as possible. So I think that's where we were thinking for allowing priority points for the compliance program.
Thank you. Evan.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could reconsider that. I'll just say a red line on limiting any funding that's in an MS4 permit. By definition, we're providing funding for non-compliant sanitary systems, things that people are supposed to have been doing, but for whatever reason they couldn't. I believe the majority of things in an MS permit, are not appropriate for this funding source, but it's always a challenge if we're chasing pollution, and we know that by definition, right, is the most polluted source of urban runoff. You hate to just draw a big X through it in case, maybe there's a major, tracing and sampling program to find an unknown pollutant that a community would really need help with or what have you. I can't imagine exactly the situation, but again, just saying we're going to totally exclude that when we know this is one of our worst problems, might knock something out that we can't foresee or anticipate. Just again, a request to reconsider.
Appreciate that, Evan. Thanks. All right, at this point, let's run through the drinking water scoring criteria, and then we'll kind of finish up with the Q&A after that, and any comments or questions following the drinking water folks.
Okay, this is Brian Thurston. I serve as one of the assistant division directors for the EGLE's Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division, and I want to walk through the scoring criteria from Public Act 132 in our first draft or proposed scoring criteria in here. Go ahead, next slide. So again, in Public Act 132, there are 5 categories, just as there are 5 categories in the wastewater world, there's 5 categories in the drinking water world. So drinking water compliance regulations, public health, drinking water quality, improving infrastructure, and then affordability, or those impacts on overburdened and significantly overburdened communities. Next. So starting out to just kind of walk through, same scoring as you've heard already earlier on there. We set a 20 points based on the legislation. That 20 points would go to overburden, and then there's an additional bump for people that are in that significantly overburdened category that James talked about earlier. Next slide. So this kind of gets into what's the differences in the details that are back in there. So we'll start back up at the top of those, the drinking water compliance, regulatory compliance in there. And so this first part of the area is to look at facility upgrades to maintain compliance. That is a core mission of the drinking water revolving funds and always has been. We have kind of downgraded this because we spread those points to other categories. So this one here has a 10-point category. Historically, this category was in our old 1,000-point structure, it was 150 points. So it's kind of been downgraded a little bit here. But again, this is one of those that pretty much every project's going to get these 10 points. Don't really have any projects that would not get those points in there, but then we're adding other areas in there to accent different things that are still on a mission to getting those points. So the next category that we have in here, this is kind of a new concept we're putting in. It's not really a new concept, but as mentioned earlier, we've been stuck with a very outdated scoring structure that was in original legislation. And so when that was originally placed in the legislation, we really have had no flexibility, and times have changed and focuses have changed. And so we are looking at capacity development as a critical means that both the federal government and the state government has been pushing to try to determine the healthiness of a community and how a community is interfacing. And so with this, we have some the subcategory of regionalization. It only has, it's a 5-point if you meet in this category, but the subcategory is to focus on the changing or the sharing, the sharing of managerial and financial capacity resources to keep reasonable rates to ratepayers. Some communities have actively engaged in the forward thinking of the management of their community and to reward these people that are doing this, looking at where they can do cost savings between sharing of resources between there. We're going to give some incentive in this here. So it's giving a carrot back to the process for doing things that are trying to keep those rates lower to your citizens. The subcategory will be evaluated by demonstrating communities have joined forces with their neighbors to improve the overall managerial or financial capacity to control rates. The goal of the subcategory is to work forward toward the TMF capacity in the waterworks throughout Michigan. So EGLE is, we had a question about this in our first hearing, so I'm just kind of going to summarize this category over here to get back to one of those questions, which was EGLE is providing these priority points to communities that are actively working on a cooperatively toward capacity building measures to improve the capacity of both of the communities. So it's not really something that is set in the project itself, but it's set in the philosophy and what's behind on there. So those would be identified in the project plan of what you're doing in there, but this is going to go back into how is that after going to go, what's that going to impact? And the other thing I want to walk into is just a little bit, because in the last piece we had some feedback from, so I'm going to just walk into what is consolidation and regionalization, kind of our thoughts on that. And this is a good opportunity to kind of walk through those things here. So consolidation, and well, we can go to the next slide so you can see why we're going to go into that. So we just talked about regionalization. Here's the word consolidation. So I want to kind of throw out a couple of where EGLE drinking water program is looking at this. So consolidation would be a situation where a community water supply was absorbed into a municipal community water supply. So examples would be a master meter connections to a mobile home park or an apartment building, making the system that was absorbed only a customer site's piping system and would no longer be under the regulatory structure of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So that would be consolidation. So the one water system goes away. So if a regional authority or another community water supply agreed to serve the local unit of government jurisdiction in its own retail customer supply, which would then eliminate the water system. That doesn't happen very often. But if it was a retail customer, this would also be considered consolidation. Again, normally most connections that come from a regional provider becomes what's called a wholesale customer, where they would retain their water system and operational control of their distribution and maybe tanks and things within there, the rest of the assets that they may have in there. So normally we do not see like a complete consolidation on the municipal side, but we do see it for like if a small subdivision development was being pulled into the township, that subdivision doesn't usually operate their system afterwards. If they did, they would then be part of it. It'd just be in a regionalization effort, not a consolidation. So consolidation, in summary, eliminates one of those water systems out. So it kind of takes it off our inventory. So in a contrast to that, we'll look at regionalization, which is kind of some of the same goals, would be a situation where multiple communities come together to form an authority. Regional provider may connect to an existing community water supply to address a source issue, but the community retains ownership and control and the direct oversight of its customers, and we call these wholesale customers. In summary, if following proposed water system improvement, all systems still have direct regulatory oversight of the Safe Drinking Water Act. This is where we consider those to be regionalized or regionalization. So over the years, one of the things that's kind of been a burden to us, or where it kind of comes into our capacity to do my staff, our staff's capacity to get things in there is that we focus many times on some very small systems that have issues that because they're small and they don't maybe have the base of the tax of the ratepayers and stuff have or don't have great operational oversight because again, they just don't have the bandwidth to have their own dedicated operator and stuff in there. Those systems take a big burden on the program as itself. And so over the years, you know, cities and villages and townships have grown and expanded their service area to include areas which have existing public water supplies. The original intent for most of the developers when they built these systems was to serve the public since there was no existing community water supply in the area available to provide that service. As communities have expanded their service areas, these service areas many times have extended to areas that now fully encompass those community water supplies. And we still regulate the township system, and we also regulate the individual community water supply inside if they have not merged or connected with that part. So the points or the reason or rationale behind trying to look at these consolidation points is to try to get these kind of mergers to occur. So many of these neighborhood supplies that are surrounded by the community water supplies have the surrounding supply has a higher quality treated water. It provides a greater level of public health protection. It provides greater reliability. It provides greater fire suppression ability. And these systems typically that would be surrounded that are not the small systems inside, those systems typically have very minimal technical, managerial, and financial capacity. So our program's focus is to try to focus our resources away from trying to put an excessive amount of our staff time into those small systems to build the TMF capacity, and instead work on merging those into the larger systems so we can work on with those larger communities on their TMF capacity. So as water mains, the goal here is as water mains are extended past existing businesses, small housing projects, or have already been historically surrounding maybe a community, that we would pick those communities up as we think about funding and what our 20-year needs for that community would be. We hope that you're looking at those small systems that may not be part of your community system, and how can we absorb those back into part of the overall greater community system, add these ratepayers back into there so we can have a good, the community can move forward without these elements of that community kind of trying to go it on their own or operate outside and have many times a lesser quality water and not near as protective of a water quality. So the next category that we have in here is if the project addresses an enforcement order. So one of the things that this is adding or opening the avenue up greater than where we were on the previous scoring side. We did have a similar set of points for criteria, but in this case here, we are if the community water is connecting. So say there's a interconnection between because there's a source water issue, and that community water supply has an order with the department, and the order doesn't have to be with the main community that's applying for the loan, but if you're addressing an order by connecting a community or a non-community or other public water supply that's there, and that's going to address those issues to come through. So there's a contamination at a source and the community's doing it. Historically, this had to be part of the order had to be with the community applying for the loan. And so we're just expanding that category that this would be able to go with. If we're addressing any of those compliance orders, then we get that 5 points. And the total points in this category, as I mentioned in the front end of this, we have all of these subcategories to come together, and then there is a total amount of points that the category would have overall. And in this category, that's 25 points for this category. Next slide. So in public health protection, and in this one here, there's a maximum in this category of 20 points for public health protection. So lead service line replacements is a critical need out there. We have lots of lead service lines, and we have new statutes that say that you have to go through and replace all those in a very over the next 20 years. We're already into that place to put there. So this is a funding source that would be able to potentially go there and look at that. And so when those lead service lines is a priority for the department, it's a priority for the state. And as we look back on the side, we've given this, so we've changed the score for historically in our last scoring. Again, this is a way of saying something that's outdated previously. We had given 25 out of 1,000 points for this category. And so we've increased this by 400% to give this to 10% of the overall points in this category for people that are working with doing things on lead service lines replacements. The removal of these historical lead service lines do provide proactive public health protection. Not necessarily is that it's a source of lead, and we need to get those sources out to ultimately meet that compliance and make sure that we're reducing that lead across the system. And so as we are looking at these things here, the ability to remove those over that 20-year period, we need to provide assistance funds. This may not be all the funds that get provided for it would come through this program, but this is one of the programs that is out there to provide there. We've had a few, we've moved money over from one program to another. In the past couple of years, we've gone through and put some grants out for different things, but right now the money was decided, and we also have some federal money to address this that came recently. And that got put into the SRF program here in the drinking water SRF program. And so we wanted to make sure that we elevate these projects going forward. And then this next category, well, let's walk through. I guess I got a question from the previous seminar. Let's just kind of walk through on here. So it's the question there was, if lead service line is important to the state priority, why would you not reward more points? So we still have to look at the overall goal of what the entire DW SRF project or plan is about, which is looking at that overall project to be evaluated. So the project plan requirements is to look at the needs of the community over the next 20 years and design a project that's going to address all of those needs. It could be phased, and one of those needs could be replacement of lead service lines for some communities, and some communities may not have that need. So we specifically have allocated dollars to the lead service line program, and I know James talked about that in the very beginning. So there's federal money that comes in sometimes in pots. And so we have different ones that are like overall SRF stuff. And then there's some lead service line, there's emerging contaminants, there's pieces there. So even though the project, if the project did not score super high because it was a project that was maybe short-sighted in the application that was received, and it only looked at lead service lines, it probably won't score super high. But if it's a project that has looked at what the 20-year needs of the community is, and it includes water main replacement, it includes maybe some looping, it includes some other infrastructure improvements that are going, it's going to score high. And this category has been moved up to be scoring higher. So, so the projects themselves have to look at how do we build the overall TMF capacity of the water system. Only looking at the lead service lines themselves and ignoring the rest of the 20-year needs would be short-sighted in providing public health protection to the residents. So the former scoring gave 2.5%, as we talked about. This is a 400% increase on the scoring, and to give it up to 10% on the marking. And as discussed, Michigan would also have providing technical assistance to assist communities in developing successful project plans. So there was a mention in earlier by James was that we have some funding that came from the legislature that allowed us to go out and do technical assistance. And in this technical assistance, we can work with communities to build successful projects that are going to have that are going to be scored enough. And almost every community has enough of these elements. They just need to make sure that they make a good effort on having a robust project when they put forward. And then the scoring, I think, will all lead service line projects, if it's part of their project, will score high. The next category in here is really to try to give carrot to those that have done the right thing for so many years and have not, and maybe historical systems haven't awarded them to this, given priority points for them doing the right things and being ahead of the curve all the time. So we can't give tons of points, but we have some in here. So public health protection in communities that have routinely had been working above the standards and haven't had any health-based violations over the past years need to be rewarded for that positive, proactive approach they have. So we put 5 points in this category. Next slide. And to walk back through a little bit on that public health side, and there we did get a question in the previous seminar that was also asking about, working on, why would we not give support for those areas that would have, if they're doing proactive measurements. And so I just wanted to point out that I don't know if that got missed, that somebody didn't realize that was in there. So the subcategory of the water systems for their total TMF capacity to continue these, to provide those internal protections that would consistently allow them to meet safe drinking water and not have public health-based violations, such as a surface water system, and one was named in a question. I won't go into that one there, that had a recent emergency, and they responded to that emergency, and they were always able to beat standards on the water that went through, and they were able to put in proactive treatments in advance, and so they can, as the source water is changing, they can continually address those items because they have good or excellent TMF capacity. And that's what we're trying to reward, is those that have put that extra protections in their system and go there. Not as high as we're going to reward, or as high as we're going to give people that have true public health issues existing that we need to address. And so this side here is about those areas where, if we do have categories where people do need to address something that is a public health issue now, that we are going to give points in there. So again, like we talked about earlier, this category has an overall 20 points. And so if you had an acute public health issue that was occurring, so that would be one of the acute MCLs or a treatment technique. So this is an immediate health hazard type thing. You're going to get 20 points. You just maxed out this category. If you had an action level exceedance, or if you have a non-acute MCL, like if you have arsenic, or if you have you're exceeding a health advisory level, or you have treatment techniques, they would get 10 points. And so say in the combination of these that you had you're replacing lead service lines and your community had a lead action level, you would maximize the category points for this subcategory. Next slide. So drinking water quality on there, this has a category, this total category has a maximum of 15 points. Improving the drinking water is the third category that we have in that we're talking about today. And consistently providing high quality water is a goal in Michigan, and utilizing the DWSRF to achieve this goal is an important way of minimizing the financial impact of these activities on Michigan residents. Many water systems have areas in their system where water stagnates, which causes inferior water quality to many residents and may lead to corrosion issues in the distribution system. Keeping high quality water throughout the entire distribution system and to the residents should be stated goal for every community water supply. And we talked about these kind of stated goals within people's asset management plans. Looping water mains to eliminate these stagnation areas in the distribution system contribute greatly to consistent water quality and increase the system reliability. Providing mechanical or static mixing in tanks can also be a great improvement to the water quality that's in there, and make sure that we have consistent water quality that's going to keep everything stable within a distribution system to minimize corrosion. So in this category, that looping of the dead end water mains or adding mixing or other things that are going to do things that are being proactive to that water quality is going to be giving them 5 points in there. And then we also, because net treatment is not always the only way you can improve water quality, you may improve water quality. We have many communities that have came into the program where they are connecting to maybe a regional provider that has a higher water quality, or it's addressing that the community maybe has an arsenic issue or something that maybe there, or heavy iron or something in their groundwater, and they're moving to a higher quality source. And so they're getting points for improving that water quality also, 5 points. Next slide. So under that same concept, the second subcategory here is that if they're treating that water, so if they're also going to provide treatment for that to an aesthetic, or maybe it's a public health treatment that's getting back in there, but providing that treatment to improve the water quality is also going to get 5 points. And then we are maintaining, as was in the original legislation, to keep this same 10% of the points for having an active source water protection program. And this is critical for how we handle, how we respond to things. And communities that have active source water protection programs have emergency response plans. They have lots of things that are available to them, and they've looked at their source water area and where they're contributing is to be able to quickly respond to that, to not have to be able to address that before that contamination would get to the citizens. So actively managing a community water supply protection program is the most effective way for a community water system to actively plan and protect its source, and to be able to quickly respond to that contamination before it impacts the community source and eventually the citizens itself. Points awarded in this category is keeping the same as we had in the past of the 10 points or 10% of the overall score. Next slide. So improving infrastructure ends up being, this is one that we have a 15-point maximum in this category. In there, it is a importance of how we work on there, and this is where we've tried to take things that are from the historic legislation into the new one here and try to take in and update things to where EGLE is and drinking water environmental health divisions priorities are. So we've recently updated our technical, managerial, and financial capacity implementation strategy, and to include asset management planning, and recognize this as a resource for evaluating and maintaining water system infrastructure. So communities that are doing things that are doing projects that are part of their asset management plan that they've turned into us, they would get 10 points for that. The wonderful thing about this is, as we do an ITA and we apply for an ITA, you put in the ITA and you get where you are in the funding piece. If this project wasn't in your asset management plan, you can update your asset management plan at any point in time. You can update for those that don't have to do asset management plans because they're smaller communities, reliability studies. We've also included that are reliability studies here, and they could put a reliability study in a capital improvements plan. All municipalities have to provide capital improvements plans. Again, if it's not in there, you can send an update, and then these points would be, you could get these awarded in the points. So it's something that is always a way to improve your score, and we want the projects that get focused on to be the ones that you guys are planning. So like a lead service line projects are all supposed to be, all that lead service line replacement is part of these, is your asset management plans. It's a requirement. So everybody should, if they're doing a lead service line replacement, these 10 points should always be as part of that project piece. Otherwise, they just need to update their asset management plan and they'll get those 10 points. So this next category is trying to make the money go a little farther, is the plan here. So sharing infrastructure assets with neighboring systems. If we have a limited number of resources that we have in the system, and we would like to try to build the TMF capacity best we can. And many times that TMF capacity doesn't mean we have to build all the reliability and redundancy in every political jurisdiction. There are times when doing things and having a tank that maybe goes across multiple political jurisdictions would be helpful, or would be advantageous to the ratepayers of that community. And so this is where if we're putting in some technical capacity assets, the physical assets, and sharing those assets across. And so if the project was doing that kind of thing, and so we're not building total redundancy, maybe that's making, instead of an emergency connection, making a connection that flows both ways, so the reliability that could be invested in portions, or the joint communities could join together to share in their reliability of their systems and not necessarily have to rebuild or duplicate all of those things in that other community. So if those types of things are happening in there, then we want to be able to, again, give a carrot to those proactive in that area. Next slide, please. So this category's got a lot of words in it, and I think the point on the first one, we got missed a little bit in the first piece. So this is really about working together, partnering out. How do we get the money? Again, to make the money, to make the limited funds we have go a little farther, but want to get out to our regional partners. So people that have a project that is coming in for USDA rural development, if they have another grant that they're using to supplement this, and so they don't need to get as much money from SRF on here, if they're providing local funds into their stuff, if they're seeking out some other program that's going to be getting things in there. Maybe they're going to put up special assessment districts as part of the payment plan for hooking that neighborhood up to their water system. All of those things could be used as positive things, allows the money to go a little further, not borrowing all that money. And that's going to, so we want to reward those with an additional 5 points, give some more priority to those projects that are working with multi-funding sources. So I did want to walk into, we had a question at the last category that came from an engineering firm. And they were asking, the most, to be most effective in being able to handle projects, there was projects that were done by USDA, and of the USDA projects, there was a small portion, the private side lead service lines, that were put projects in on, and sometimes those didn't score high enough to be funded in there. And, they would like that to be, we need to observe that. And I feel that's an excellent comment, and we try to, this is one of the ways we're trying to do that. So we do award points in this category here for those that are doing cost sharing in this category 4. The updated law allows consultants to use documents prepared for other funding sources as a project plan. And so that's critical in the change. And what happened is that we don't have to have an independent project plan now. We have to have the elements of the project plan, but you can reference those other engineering studies, those other documents that are out there. So these, as we put together that, so it shouldn't be much of a burden to bring it into the project plan piece here. And if the projects were scored, if overall these big projects that were being referenced here were scored for all of the aspects of that project, they would score very high in our system. And so one of the things that I think as a consultants need to be doing is we got to look at, if we're going to partner these funding sources together, we got to make sure that the package that's being submitted for the project plan includes some of those other things. So look at our scoring pieces and take some elements out of that overall project, because the project really can't go forward without both funding sources. And if it can't go forward without both funding sources, then let's spread a little bit of that into both of the projects to make it so they are high scoring. So if we were to take on some of the things, like if we're closing off some loops on some water mains, and if we're adding a mixer or something, maybe we put that into the SRF element of it. If we are beyond just the lead service line, so put some of that water main in, then they could get the additional scoring points in there to make sure that the project score is high. So if you looked at taking a typical USDA project that was just a lead service line replacement, and I threw out some categories here. So in category 1, they would get the 10 points. In category 2, they would also get another 10 points there. In category 4, they'd at least get the 15 points. And that's 58% of the total points allowable in those categories. So they're pretty high scoring. And then if the community were to add in some things in there, like there was, they had a source water protection plan, they had a good health-based violation history, or they didn't have a good health-based violation history and they fit one of those other categories, they would add on additional points. If they had regionalization plans in there, they would add points for those. So there's many places at which we can get things to build out that score, but I think that projects that are in there will score higher under this new criteria for things that are doing multi-funding sources. But one of the ways that we have worked and we've encouraged people to do is to look at, maybe don't take one element out of that USDA project because that wasn't fundable under them, but think about taking a few elements out, just a little bit of that. Maybe it's only still 10% of the project or 5% of the project, but make that a more robust project and it will score out fully within this criteria. That's next slide. So we did have to walk through a little bit in here, just kind of, we put out what the tiebreakers were. We currently use tiebreakers 1 and 3 is what's been used in the historical legislation. We plan to move forward with those. And then we put in a tiebreaker of a 2 in there. If the project has consolidation, it would move ahead of one without consolidation. Next slide. So this is just looking at the overall scoring, because I in the slide, you can't kind of see how these things fit together. So you can see that in any subcategories, if you summed all the subcategory pieces together, they would definitely exceed the category that's maxed. That's intentional. So before we had where project scores were scoring fairly low, and they were scoring low predominantly because you didn't have the ability to add and accumulate the points in there. And so one of the things to just kind of point out on the side here is that if we look at on this, that's consolidation. On the consolidation side, every system that's being, so multiple systems being consolidated gives more points. So if you pick up a hardware store, you get 3 points for the hardware store. You pick up the school, you might get 3 points for the school. You pick up a small neighborhood, you get 5 points for that. But they're all cumulative in here to that max score of 25. And the same goes into the public health protection. You could get multiple ways you could get to that max scoring thing. So again, because projects don't have all of these elements at all times, but we want things to be competitive, but at different avenues that bring them competitive to make them competitive. Next slide. And so the same thing goes through, same trend through all of them. If you look at there, so again, in category 3, there's 4 items there. The total for that's 25 points, but only 15 is that maximum score. Again, trying to stay within 100 points is our maximum, and divvying points in there. And we decided that, or the legislature decided, I should say, that category 5 has a certain 20 points in there. And then we wanted to have a little bit more points for that significantly overburdened. So that took a big chunk of points back out of there. And so we have a couple 25 categories and a couple 15 categories. Next slide. That's it.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. We've had a couple of good comments in the chat. We, of course, saved those. I'm also going to have Kimber put her email in the chat. And if people have further comments or questions, they can send them to that email and we'll make sure they get to the right people. As I mentioned earlier, we do plan to stand up a web page to kind of consolidate all of this information at one place as we move forward. And of course, there is going to be one more step here. Once we receive those comments, look at everything, we'll finalize the proposal and we'll take that out for a public hearing in September. And we'll be announcing that date shortly. At this point, anybody first have questions on the drinking water scoring criteria? Let's limit it to that issue. Anybody have any further questions or comments on that topic? Cindy.
Yeah, I just want to echo the concern about how decisions regarding consolidation are made. There are many challenges at the community level for engaging with water utilities in the decision-making process. And I understand, having served on EPA's National Drinking Water Advisory Council and on the arsenic cost review panel for that standard, I fully understand the issues regarding systems coordinating services and all of those related factors. However, there also are significant concerns, in particular in environmental justice communities, where communities are sort of forced into arrangements that aren't necessarily in the interest that they would like to maintain for themselves. And so with all of the, I guess, momentum towards consolidation, both through this and through other, spaces, it's important to continue to lift up the historic context that a lot of these communities like Benton Harbor have endured in the evolution of those communities. And so I'm raising it here again because it's important, I think, to raise it in all of the spaces where these conversations are happening, so they're not fragmented, and that there's a real authentic way to make decisions that aren't just driven by factors that are based on a spreadsheet and the current financial realities for a particular community. So I'm raising that. And I also want to raise concerns around, the asset management plan, association with the asset management plans. I think we all can understand the importance of having an asset management plan, but in the lead and copper rule, we were able to include criticality consideration for lead service line replacement. But practically speaking, the way that these plans are often playing out, the neighborhoods where the lead service lines are located are not prioritized for highest consideration when project plans come forward. And therefore, as we look at communities that are, anticipating the potential of going beyond 20 years, a lot of that is tied to the asset management plan, and it's tied to the cadence and the priority that they're placing on service lines and also on neighborhoods. And when you coordinate that with other asset management planning, whether it's roads or other projects, which I know has been another push. I talked with a number of people who have indicated that their neighborhood roads are not prioritized in terms of like that aspect of planning. So I'm just, again, putting that out there, that asset management planning is a great idea, but we have to lift up where lead service line replacement lands. Consolidation can work, regionalization can work, but the voice of the people in those communities and the historic context of the community and the water system have to be taken into consideration. And we can't go at this as if there isn't a broader context around both of those. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing this in writing. It's good to get an overview, but it's also difficult to take it all in at one time.
So Cindy, on one of the, couple things in there. So consolidation, as we're putting it, really has, when we talk about consolidation, that's elimination of that kind of water supply that's existing. That's the context that we're looking in the world of consolidation. And so that's those, a mobile home park that there's a water main right out in front of it, and it needs to connect to that higher quality water. They have issues going on within there. So to meet that TMF capacity that's going in there, not looking at it being from the standpoint of a most of the time we very seldom do we see retail customer type things that are consolidation. So I definitely hear what you're saying. And those would be more on those regionalization efforts. There's things that are going to keep that rates down as much as we can. But know that this, when we look at the context of this is not our regulatory approach. This is not how we would go back in doing others. We're going to be looking at making sure that a community can have technical, managerial, and financial capacity. This is not the only funding source, and this is not the only thing being looked at. When we look at a compliance side, we're looking at that technical, financial, and managerial capacity to the community and having discussions about that. This is an option for them to come in and apply for this funding. And if they're doing certain things, this would allow them to score better in the funding. In other places, we've seen, earmarks come straight off that give a community an earmark for being able to do things. And that also is a funding source. And, other communities have applied to other federal funding sources, and we write letters all the time to get these other funding sources or to get that back into put in there. So this is not the only source, but I definitely hear what you're saying on there. Asset management wise, all lead service line replacement of that 20-year concept has to be incorporated into people's asset management plan. So anybody who's doing lead service line replacement, whether they choose to focus in this neighborhood first or this other neighborhood first, if they're doing lead service line placement as part of their project, it is going to be in their asset management plan because it's a requirement for them to put that in their asset management plan. So they would get those points.
Right. And they do have the option of blowing out the back end of that 20 years with those asset management plans, but that's another whole story. And I appreciate your clarifying that part. I heard that before, but I also think there are many conversations taking place, and not all of those conversations are using the same words to describe what they mean by consolidation and regionalization. And so, you know, again, I think it's really important that we not conflate. And we also, in whatever the instance is about decisions that are impacting people's lives in these communities, that they have a real opportunity to engage. And that is currently not the case. So thank you very much.
No, appreciate that, Cindy. And I've heard Ryan over the last month get better and better at that definition. So I think we're honing in on some very specific definitions of those terms so that we don't get confusion after we start seeing applications. So I think we're moving forward in that. Jill.
Hi there. I appreciate it. I just want to really hone in on follow up on what Cindy was saying in terms of, if it's not defined, this will be an incentive. And so while we may think about a 200-person system hooking up to a much larger system, in reality, it could be as an incentive that does impact someplace like Benton Harbor or another place. And that human component is so critical, and without that self-governance piece, there really is an equity issue. And so I just want to keep putting that out there, that if you see this need as a very specific one, can we define that into the definition then by certain size or capacity, because it is a different thing when it's community and community.
No, it's a good point. And again, you know, we're looking at overall trends. I mean, Michigan, obviously, we have a lot of systems that is mostly due to the fact that we've always had high quality groundwater. So a system could be set up simply by popping in a well and going with it. But we also see some trends where we're having to close down some of these systems because they're failing to provide water and, you know, kicking people out of their housing, you know, and things like that when people can't maintain high quality or, you know, good drinking water, can't maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, you know, we see ripples on that side of the equation. We're very interested on any kind of language you can think that kind of reflects some of the comments you've made and how we would incorporate that into something like the SRF project. No, we hear you, and again, I reaffirm what Brian says. We're trying to provide as much support for those communities who want to kind of remain. Nahara?
Yes, I had to step away, so I apologize. This was previously covered. I just wanted to know, like, in preparation for the public hearing, will there be documents of like the proposed new scoring criteria and the slides? Is that going to be, is that going to live somewhere on the EGLE website?
Yeah, we're going to stand up its own separate page. You'll see the slide decks from the presentations. You'll see the proposed language, any spreadsheets we plan to work from. We'll set that all up on a page, hopefully shortly here. We'll get that information. I think maybe we've captured everyone who is registered. If we have that ability, we'll send out when we get that web page stood up. Any other questions, comments?
James, there's a good comment from or question from Sally in the chat.
Hi there. I just added a question to the chat that I was forwarded this email or this invitation from somebody else. And, you know, I've been working on SRF project plans for over 20 years as a consultant. And I don't see the usual cast of people that I know work on these kinds of things, or the communities that often apply for these things. So I don't know if I'm in the wrong work group, or if there was going to be another reach out to the people who have actually had to put together these plans over the last 20, 30 years. I'm just kind of curious because I see a lot of planning people, which is great to get, you know, the more strategic type comments, but you know, from a ground level, putting the plan together type of thing. I just don't see those kinds of people participating here. Maybe I'm missing something.
I don't know if either of our presenters, I know we pushed it out to some of the, you know, associations where those consultants, you know, are active participants. I'm not exactly sure how it got pushed out from there. These won't be the only avenues. We've had some separate one-off meetings with various groups of people. Prior to this, I don't know if either of the kind of divisions, drinking water or clean water, plan to kind of continue those discussions with some of those other crowds. But again, we're looking for all potential input. So I'll touch base with Phil and Brian on that afterwards.
Yeah, and I just received clarification that I believe like MWA did invite certain folks, which is great. And maybe the intent was to have a sampling of people across various circles. So that might be the answer. But again, I do think you might get some more granular type of things of hurdles that have been experienced in putting these plans together from a different type of work group. So just, I appreciate that answer.
Yeah, we realize that we're also tricky in that we got new legislation which streamlined the process a little bit. At the same time, we're kind of redefining some terms and scoring. So a lot of new things on the table for folks. So I'm sure we'll be doing some more educational outreach.
Yeah, and we have done, so we have a quarterly water call and talked about that and walked out some of the stuff and did exposure on there. And we'll continue to keep marketing in that side. There's going to be a, you know, part of the public hearing. There'll also be a public comment session from that point. I'm sure, James, to get public comments at that point and back. So we'll have a way of getting written ones. We also are hitting like the American Waterworks Association. Eric will be addressing this as it is open, and this is a piece so to try to get to those other consultants and stuff too.
Urge people to kind of get any questions or comments in early. We don't have an official cutoff at this point, but the earlier you get kind of comments in gives us a little better chance to take them into consideration. We'll of course be taking comments all the way through our public hearing, which we expect to be in mid-September. Any final questions, comments people have? Really want to thank everyone that participated this week and last. We've appreciated all the input. I think we're getting we're honing these proposals down, hopefully kind of focusing it on those communities and those projects that we want to see funded. We've appreciated the support the legislature has given us as far as kind of an increase in allocation for water infrastructure projects. We'll, in the next couple of weeks, be announcing kind of the intended use plans for those dollars that have been allocated. Unfortunately, our demand for water infrastructure money has also grown exponentially. So when we release those plans, you'll see both kind of what we're able to fund and those communities who are seeking money that we did not have sufficient money to get to. But hopefully we can kind of convince our legislature to keep up the support in this kind of critical area moving forward. So I see a quick question. What's the timeline? I don't know, other than I think it is in the next few weeks. I'm not sure if it's officially September 1 or not, but we can double check that. I know it's something that we've been working on. So
James, there's another comment too about the comments that came in today, whether or not we're going to integrate them in with the public hearing comments or how that's going to work.
Yeah, again, we're getting all the comments to the key staff who have been working on these projects and are working to refine both the definitions and the scoring criteria. So we get them into the hands of the people that will then kind of present the final language and final scoring criteria at the public hearing. Again, then that same group will continue to look at everything that comes up until that time. All right. Again, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hopefully we'll talk to all of you again soon. Thanks.